Okay, I think there's still some people get filtering in, but I think we might as well get started. So my name is Shannon McNulty. I'm an estate planning lawyer in New York City. And I have with me today Pablo Velez of the law firm of Velez, Cipriano. And we're going to be discussing some of the recent developments in immigration law and also how those developments are affecting clients' estate planning and tax issues. So welcome, Pablo. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Pablo, why don't you tell us a little bit about the type of work that you do?
Sure. So as you were mentioning, my firm, Valezan Cipriano, we are also a New York-based corporate immigration firm. So our big focus is on work and investor visas. These are mainly related to the Japanese population who are opening branches and subsidiaries in the United States. So we do everything from serving as outsourced in-house counsel to these companies, as well as coming up with visa strategies for their executives, managers, and specialist workers.
Great. Well, then I think it will be a wealth of information for our topic today. So I want to start, there's been so many, immigration has just been such a hot topic for quite a number of years now, but I think it's gotten even more so in the last few years, certainly with the Trump administration. And then in addition to that, with COVID-19 has had a big impact on immigration. And I'd love to explore some of those issues with you. So first of all, why don't you tell us, can you just tell us generally about the types of issues that have come up during this administration and what effect that has had on your clients? I know a lot of my clients, the issues that I've seen on my end are delays in visa processing. Some of it is not necessarily legal. It's a concern about the treatment of immigrants and the perception that people have of immigrants. And I think that's been affecting the people who are here and making them reconsider their intentions about staying here or going back to their home country. And then also for COVID-19 has also had an impact in terms of, I think, just having something like this be so devastating. One, not being able to travel to a lot of countries, and two, as well, just emotionally feeling like it's really hard to be somewhere that's really far from your family when we're going through a crisis like this. So why don't you tell us about, I guess we can start with the immigration developments over the last 4 years of how things have changed. And I believe that there has not been actually any changes to the law, but there are things that can change at the executive branch level in terms of the policies and processes and executive orders that can affect the immigration process.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this is a very robust issue, and the reason being is because, like you mentioned before, there's so many different layers. There's the administrative layer, which is basically the president and the executives level's ability to enforce the way that immigration law is handled and how applications, petitions are processed. There's also the political component, whereas the administration's taken a stance that's not as immigrant friendly as some prior administrations, and they've made that quite clear in terms of wanting to curb immigration to a certain degree. So that's also played a role. Specifically, what's happened since the beginning of the Trump administration is that there's a lot of fear that was created by folks who did not think that their status was necessarily secure. So we saw two things happen. One is that we actually saw an uptick in applications, which what I call upgrade applications, which is folks who had non-immigrant work visas all of a sudden were pressuring their companies, and the companies felt the same pressure to sponsor their permanent residency. If anyone was a permanent resident, that probably pushed them to apply for citizenship. Basically, everyone trying to become a little bit more secure in their status. What's happened is that the system has taken on a level or volume of petitions that it wasn't really built to handle, and the administration made no effort in order to scale up to handle the increased volume. So that's why we have a lot of backlog, coupled with the fact that they also implemented certain things that restricted or slowed down the visa process. For instance, before there was no such thing as an employment-based permanent residency interview, whereas these interviews were subjective and exclusive to marriage-based and family-based petitions, where an officer could detect fraud by answering someone or asking someone questions in live time, whereas with employment, basically the person would appear before the officer and the officer would just be able to answer or ask them questions based on what they've submitted without any knowledge of their position. So there's been two things basically clogging the system and creating a lot of backlog. To exacerbate that exponentially is COVID-19 and the fact that the government closed off regular visa processing at the State Department level since March 20th. So basically no new visas have been issued since that time. There was a sort of a soft open July 15th, where the State Department announced that they would start reopening consulates based on the level of COVID in different countries. However, on that very limited basis, there hasn't really been any movement there. So there's a lot of backlog with respect to not just folks who are here who wait a long time to process their applications domestically, but also folks who are coming into the country for the first time. On top of that, an additional layer, which is the president has issued several executive orders over the course of the pandemic, basically suspending different visas from being processed at all until January of this coming year. So all of those things compounded have really just sort of brought the immigration system to a grinding halt. And, you know, everyone's just trying to muddle through the waters and do the best that they can.
Oh, that's a lot. And I think that this is affecting so many people. Are there visas that are currently being processed? Are we kind of just at a standstill for any visas? Are there certain types of visas that are maybe getting through, or is this kind of like a blanket, just, you know, kind of everything's frozen?
Sure. So domestically, there's still a lot of visas being processed. So for instance, if folks are already here in the US and already have a valid status, because the administration did carve out a lot of exceptions to these sort of seemingly blanket orders. So folks are able to apply for citizenship if they are permanent residents. They are able to apply for permanent residency at this point, either through family or through employment, either category. There's a lot of backlog that's being dealt with, obviously, but it is moving. Domestically, USCIS continued to work through the pandemic because they're all remotely located anyway. So that wasn't really something that got very much affected. However, constructively, there has been a stoppage on all new visas being issued for folks who are coming into the United States that require a visa interview, because the consular officers are just not conducting these interviews due to COVID. And it was basically a constructive way of shutting down our borders. And COVID sort of gave the blanket excuse to be able to do that and hold it for prolonged periods of time. So now we're just starting to see small openings, very limited, but realistically, they're still dealing with backlog from January of this year and before for folks who are already in line to wait to come in. So there's very, very slow movement on that. And I don't think we're going to see anything really change until after the election, one way or another.
Okay, that's really helpful. I guess it's good that we are seeing some movement, but I think for the folks who are looking to apply for visas, if you are outside of the US, it's pretty much no go, right? It's
Correct.
like you're not going to have much luck there. But if you are inside the US and you're applying for a permanent residency or citizenship, then you could still go ahead and apply, but it's probably going to take longer than it previously did. And previously it took pretty long as well, right?
Exactly. And something to note as well is that immigration is also in flux in the way that they're looking to process some of these applications. none of the changes have really come about in large ways because federal judges have blocked things such as fee increases. And for a period of time, there was even a block on public charge requirement, whereas folks who were applying for non-immigrant and the green card had to provide further proofs showing that they could sponsor or sufficiently take care of themselves in the United States. So showing things like bank statements, credit reports, and other items that just weren't a requirement before. So it's just, again, I mean, you know, looking at it from a neutral standpoint, you can say this is just an added measure of security, but, you know, politically speaking, it was something very much done to appease folks who want to see a more restricted immigration system.
Okay. I just want to jump in terms of the tax sort of from my end of things, where I see, and as you were saying, I think there is an increased interest for folks who want to stay here, applying for citizenship, applying for permanent residency. And that's because from my one class that I took in immigration law in law school, as I recall, there's just varying levels of protection for these categories of people. So if you're a US citizen, it's very hard to get your citizenship revoked. That's a really, really, really high bar.
Correct.
Unless you're like a trader or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then for legal permanent resident, then there are, that's sort of the next level, that they still have similar protections to US citizens, but they still have requirements for their visa. So if they do violate the visa requirements, then they could be, their visa could be revoked. And then you have the next level, which is temporary workers. So people who are here on temporary visas, which have probably the lowest level of protection, at least under our Constitution. For those immigrants who are looking to become a permanent resident or a citizen, I get a lot of questions about what are the tax implications of that, and being concerned about what that will, how that will affect them from a tax perspective. And just what I generally tell them is that if they're here and they're living here, whether you're here on a temporary visa, whether you're here as a permanent resident, or whether you're here as a US citizen, if you're living in the US, your income taxes are pretty much going to be the same, because you're not going to, unless you leave the US, you're going to be subject to worldwide income taxation, regardless of your immigration status, if you are living here for a full year. If you become a legal permanent resident, then it's pretty much the same thing. But once you leave the country, you're still subject to worldwide income taxation. However, you could lose your visa at that point. And this is something, as what I've been hearing, and I'd be interested to hear from you, that there has been increased enforcement of the conditions of the visa, of the the green card, in terms of spending time outside of the country. Previously, I had clients tell me they could spend a lot of time outside of the country and come back in, and there was never any issue. And now they're starting to be, if you're gone for a certain amount of time, that there are, then they're really starting to challenge whether you can retain your green card. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that's affecting your clients?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. So with respect to permanent residents specifically, there's an expectation that they are domiciled in the US, meaning that this is their permanent home, although they don't hold a US passport yet. So the expectation in the law basically states that if a permanent resident is out of the country for over 180 days in one trip, there is a rebuttable presumption that they intended to basically abandon status that they have to overcome at a port of entry. So Customs and Border is going to take a look at their green card and their passport, and they're going to note that they've been out for 6 months or more, up to a year. So this is the first threshold. It's a rebuttable presumption between 6 and 12 months, where they basically can show proof such as temporary leave from their U.S. employer, maintaining a lease or a mortgage here in the U.S., and any other proofs that sort of anchor them down here to the country. Once they reach that 1-year threshold, then it is the practice of Customs and Border to not allow permanent residents to re-enter the country. So what they would have to do in this instance is basically go to a local consulate before even attempting to come back into the US and applying for a special immigrant visa, called an SB1. And basically the way that that works is that they show that they've had certain circumstances keeping them overseas for over a year, but they did not indeed intend to relinquish their residency status. And once they can prove that to a consular officer and have that visa issued, that would basically be their ticket back into the US, coupled with their passport, and at this point, their green card as well. So it's very important to note for those two thresholds for folks who are staying outside of the US physically for that period of time. Now, there's a way to avoid all of this headache, which is if a permanent resident has the opportunity to do so before they leave the country, and they know that they're going to be out of the US for over 180 days at a time, or whatever it is, they should apply for what's called a reentry permit. A reentry permit is basically a second passport that they'll carry with their green card and with their passport from their country of origin. And this passport or reentry permit shows that they do not intend to relinquish their residency, and it gives them permission to stay outside of the US for up to 2 years. So the only, I guess, downside to this is if they had any plans for applying for citizenship, they wouldn't make the physical presence requirement, but it does protect them from relinquishing their green card if they are overseas for up to 2 years time, if they do carry this document. So it's very important for folks who are thinking about staying overseas for prolonged periods of time or getting in that situation to do that. If they're permanent residents who are already overseas and they have not yet hit the 12-month mark, what my advice would be is to come back into the US and apply for this document before leaving again, in order to protect themselves if they plan on spending, even more time abroad. So that's just a very general but solid piece of advice for anyone who's going to spend significant time overseas.
Okay, that's great advice to know about. And it seems like the easiest thing would be if they can, because well, even certainly now it's particularly challenging, is to come back within 180 days.
Correct.
And I do have clients who they make sure that they come back, every 4 months or something, to make sure you sort of like fill that requirement.
Exactly. It's like resetting the clock.
Yeah, and then
Exactly.
so then they are not questioned. And then I also want to just pipe in here about the tax consequences of that, because I think a lot of people, they are going and living somewhere else thinking, oh, well, I have my green card, and there's privileges that go along with that you can come back at any time. You don't need to apply for any kind of visa, tourist visa or work visa. And knowing that they have to continue to pay taxes here. But if they have that green card revoked because they have been outside of the US and then they try to come back, they could be subject to expatriation taxes or exit taxes. And that is a tax that is applied if you are quote unquote a covered expatriate is the term for it. That means that you've had a green card for more than 7 years and you've abandoned it, or it's been deemed to be abandoned by staying outside of the US for too long. And you either have a net worth of more than $2 million or federal income tax, you pay federal income taxes of more than about $165,000 per year, or you don't file a particular form to certify your tax compliance. And if you fall into this category, and the most common is that you're a green card holder for a long period of time, and you either have abandoned it unintentionally or you've deliberately abandoned it. And if that happens, then you're subject and you fall into one of these categories with either the net worth test, the income tax test, or the certification test, then you are subject to this exit tax. And the exit tax is an acceleration of the capital gains on any increase in appreciation of assets, of capital assets, on the relinquishment of your green card. And then also a deemed withdrawal of any 529 accounts and IRA accounts. So these are deemed to be withdrawn all at once. The other impact of that is often missed, sometimes people say, oh, well, I don't have a big IRA and I don't have a huge amount in capital gains, is that if you leave any assets to a US resident or a US citizen as a covered expatriate, either by gift or through your will, by bequest, then those are subject to an inheritance tax at 40%. And it doesn't matter how long you've been outside of the country, it doesn't matter where those assets are, they will be subject to that tax. And so a lot of my clients have children who were born in the US or have US citizenship otherwise. And so if they passed away being covered expatriates, then 40% of their assets would be gone to the government before they went to their kids. And so that's something that a lot of people miss, and they don't realize that it has this enormous impact. So I do tell clients that if you are thinking of leaving the US, either get US citizenship so that you don't end up in this situation where you're deemed to have abandoned your green card and you're subject to the expatriation tax. You can stay outside of the US as a citizen for an indefinite period, forever, if you wanted to, and still retain your citizenship. And then the other thing is, if you do have a permanent residency visa, then to be keeping track of how long you have that for. So if you're thinking maybe at some point you would leave the US, then you probably want to relinquish that green card before you hit the 8-year mark. Because if you do it before then you're not going to be subject to these rules. And I'm not sure in terms of an immigration law perspective, does that affect their ability to get a green card again later on, or how does that work?
It doesn't necessarily. So you can always, and this just sort of applies to immigration in general, unless fraud is committed, basically all applications and the relinquishment of them are considered without prejudice, and you can basically file an unlimited amount of times given different circumstances. And this happens quite often. I mean, I've seen in many occasions with our clients that they'll come back with us on a refiling because a lot of times a business opportunity pops up overseas, and what they thought would be sort of a year-long project or 2-year-long project actually turns into something a little bit more long-term. So they're overseas and they're not really coming into the US or worried about maintaining their status. But eventually some come around and they do want to reside again in the US as permanent residents. As long as they have some kind of a nexus that'll allow them to apply for a green card, being it family-based or if it's investment-based for the most part in these circumstances, it's not a problem, because basically all of these things, again, are done without prejudice. So you're never really completely barred from the US unless you make yourself inadmissible, which again comes with fraud, misrepresentation, or maybe some other criminal conviction that gets picked up along the way, or anything else that would make someone inadmissible to the US.
Okay, that's great to know. So if you do feel like you need to leave the US and you're not going to be able to maintain that continuous residency, then it's a good idea, if it's before the 8-year mark, that you just relinquish, you abandon your green card, and you could always reapply. With
Correct.
the caveat, of course, that the laws could change at any time. And so I think that's something we're being particularly aware of right now.
Also correct. And immigration, unfortunately, it's we want to speak about it in very neutral ways, but a lot of the laws are politically driven, and a lot of the proposed changes and things like that tend to happen during and after elections, specifically, and then there's sort of a lull, and you don't really hear about immigration in the headlines anymore. So this is really a time for folks who are on the fence or thinking about their status in particular, to take action. The reason being is because exactly you just never know what will happen during an administration change, or if the makeup of Congress changes in such a way that it could go one way or another. It's really important to just sort of take advantage of the situation as it stands now, because things can change. It may be to someone's benefit, but it may not be, and that's, that's somewhat of a gamble.
Yeah, and I will say from a tax perspective, a question that I get a lot is there a downside to applying for citizenship from a tax perspective? And what I tell clients is if you've had your green card for over 7 years, more than 7 years, then it's not going to make any difference because you're still going to go through that covered expatriate, whether if you abandon your citizenship or you abandon your green card, and you're still it could be subject to this covered expatriate status. So whether you have a green card or you have a citizenship, it's not going to make much difference. And then as well, for estate tax issues, it's actually better to be a US citizen than it is to be a green card holder. There are certain benefits for some clients, not all, kind of depends on your financial situation. But they're generally, from a tax perspective, once you are what we call a long-term green card holder, then there's not going to be much downside to applying for citizenship. And like we were saying earlier, the citizenship is a much more secure, has a lot more protections than pretty much any other type of visa. So I think this has been really helpful. And I wanted to sort of, before we wrap up, just get your thoughts on what could possibly change. I know we're sort of looking into the future with a crystal ball here, but we have an election coming up. And how do you foresee, if there is not a change in administration, I assume we can kind of expect more of the same. If there isn't a change of the administration, tell us what you would expect may change if that happens.
Sure. Really interesting question, and it's almost, I can give a prediction generally based on what I think the different candidates would do, but there's also the caveat, and it's coupled with what is the makeup of Congress going to be. So just to start with my impression of what's going to happen on an executive level. So again, like you mentioned, if President Trump wins, we'll probably see a lot more of the same. There are certain categories, for instance, like the H-1B, that the administration's taking a hard look at, and they're basically making it so difficult and onerous to apply that they're constructively eliminating it without Congress actually taking that action. So they're sort of moving around that. They don't have the makeup and Republican control to actually be able to do that. But constructively, by making the enforcement and requirements on that level of adjudication so difficult, they constructively keep people from utilizing that particular category. So that's one very clear example. It's a little bit unfortunate, in my opinion, because a lot of folks who come on temporary worker visas have more of a tendency to become longer term entrepreneurs and actually hire more American workers, so creating more work. But these statistics, I guess, aren't really in front of the administration at this point. But on the flip side, I think if a Biden administration comes in, we're going to see a reversal of a lot of the things that have been done on the executive level, namely the suspension of the deferred action for childhood arrivals, which is something that the Trump administration blocked, that the Obama administration created in order to help the folks who would benefit from what's called the DREAM Act, or a law that allows for children who are brought to the US below the age of 16, who know no other country but this one, to apply for a more permanent residency, because really the crime, or the immigration offense committed by their parents was done with them being minors, so they really didn't have the intent to do anything like that. And there's close to 1 million of these folks who would be eligible if something like that were to come to fruition. So that would probably be reversed. And any other restriction on that end, if the Democrats can take the Senate and control away from Mitch McConnell, who has basically blocked any initiatives on any forward progress on immigration, there might be a bipartisan bill that can be had, is my impression if that happens. But that's a huge if, especially because of the makeup of the Senate and what races are happening right now. So I'm seeing more of, either more of the same and maybe just a reversal of a lot of the Trump policies. But in general, until Congress can take bipartisan action, there's probably not going to be much change.
Okay, well, that's really helpful. And in terms of the slowdown in the visa processing, and I mean, do you feel like that's mostly attributed to, there was some pre-COVID slowdown, which maybe that will change? Would that be fair?
I believe so. And I think that it's inevitable, whichever side ends up winning this election, that at least at the State Department level, things will speed up and get back to normal, in my opinion, because there will be no political capital lost if the president wins re-election. I think that the administration's posture will probably be open everything, full stop, the virus is a hoax, and business as usual, let's see who makes it and who doesn't make it. And that would allow folks to come into the country either for business or for pleasure. And one thing I will say is that the investment visas have not really been stopped or restricted in any way outside of just the general interviewing. So I could see, just in terms of getting the economy up again and getting the numbers up, that would probably happen. It's just sort of a full stop. There's no re-election to worry about moving from here on forward. So why not? If the Biden administration comes in January, I think they'll have sort of a more, I guess, phased in way of reopening consular processing, and possibly starting with immediate relatives and then moving on to workers and such, depending on safety and where the COVID levels are at that point. But I think that's going to play a huge role, as well as just sort of the lingering pandemic and the numbers and where they are.
Interesting. Well, this has been really helpful and super interesting. Is there anything else that you wanted to add? Do you feel like there's anything that we missed that you wanted to sort of just get in at the last minute?
Well, no, I mean, I think this was a great conversation, and it just sort of reminds me of a lot of questions that my clients also ask about different tax consequences and things like that. So it's just great to, have someone to sort of partner with and be able to, assist them on that level as well. So thank you for having me.
Sure, thank you. And if anybody has any questions, you can type them in the Q&A. I don't think there's any questions right now, but I'll just give it a couple minutes just in case anybody wants to raise anything. And you can also reach either me or Pablo, and our contact information will be on the video. It's Shannon McNulty. You can reach me at shannon@mcnulty-law.com or mcnulty-law.com, the website. Pablo, do you want to tell everyone how they could reach you?
Yes, so we are at www.velcip.com. My email address is pvelez, as in my last name, VELEZ @velcip.com. And the number for our firm is 646-736-7782.
Okay, great. Actually, we do have a question. And the question is there any gift estate tax exemption available on the 40% gift inheritance tax on covered expatriate gifts and bequests? The answer to that is no, there is no exemption at all. So even though it's even worse than if you have just non-resident alien, which has the 60,000, for the covered expatriate, there is none. And there's not even a graduated estate tax rate. It's just a flat, whatever is the highest rate. So they're pretty much, you're not in a good situation if you're trying to leave assets to a US person. Okay, well, and And anyone who is on here or who may be watching subsequently can certainly feel free to reach out to me or Pablo if you have any follow-up questions that we can help with. And Pablo, it was great having you here today. And thanks for everyone who joined us.
Hey, thank you for having me.